Most people think of World War II as a contest of factories, divisions, and firepower. What's often missed is that for millions of soldiers, survival hinged on small, improvised practices that had nothing to do with grand strategy. These were not heroic battlefield maneuvers. They were quiet habits, field adaptations, and unspoken rules passed from veteran to recruit, often unofficial, sometimes explicitly suppressed. In several cases, military authorities discouraged or outright ordered soldiers not to discuss these techniques, not because they were ineffective, but because they revealed uncomfortable truths about planning failures, morale, or the limits of doctrine. To understand how men actually survived World War II, you have to look beneath the official manuals and into the spaces where necessity overruled ideology. The first survival lessons soldiers learned rarely came from training manuals. Formal instruction before deployment emphasized discipline, weapon handling, and unit cohesion. What it did not fully prepare soldiers for was prolonged exposure to cold, hunger, disease, and uncertainty. Veterans quickly discovered that rigid adherence to regulations could be dangerous. British and American infantrymen in North Africa learned to ignore uniform rules about sleeves and headgear, covering exposed skin with improvised cloth to prevent dehydration and sun damage. On the Eastern Front, German soldiers quietly replaced issued foot wraps with civilian socks when possible, despite regulations, because frostbite was a more immediate threat than inspection penalties. Learning when not to use issued equipment became a form of quiet resistance. Standard issue gear was designed for average conditions that rarely existed in combat zones. In the Pacific, United States Marines discovered that steel helmets reflected light and attracted enemy fire during jungle patrols. Many dulled them with mud or foliage, despite standing orders to maintain equipment. Similarly, Soviet troops often abandoned heavy packs during advances, carrying only essentials to preserve stamina, even though doctrine emphasized full loadouts. Commanders tolerated this informally while discouraging discussion, because acknowledging it meant admitting that logistical assumptions were flawed. Survival depended on knowing which rules could be bent without consequences and which could not. Food scavenging and informal ration modification kept units functional longer than planned. Official rations were calculated for caloric sufficiency on paper, not in the field. Soldiers across all armies supplemented them through scavenging, barter, or quiet theft. German soldiers in occupied territories frequently traded with civilians for eggs and bread, despite strict prohibitions. Allied troops in Italy and France did the same. Understanding terrain as shelter, not just as ground to be crossed, saved countless lives. Military maps treated terrain in terms of movement and fire lanes. Soldiers learned to read it differently. In Normandy, infantrymen quickly discovered that hedgerows were not just obstacles, but, life-saving windbreaks and concealment from artillery fragments. Silence and restraint often mattered more than aggression in survival situations. Combat narratives emphasized bold action, but survival frequently depended on knowing when not to engage. Medical self-care and peer treatment filled gaps left by overwhelmed field services. Frontline medical care was often delayed or inaccessible. Soldiers learned basic wound cleaning, blister management, and infection prevention from medics or, honestly, just experience. Weather awareness became a tactical skill separate from command planning. Operational plans accounted for seasons, but individual survival depended on micro-level weather interpretation. Psychological survival required habits that official doctrines struggled to address. Fear, fatigue, and moral injury were, constant companions. Soldiers developed quiet coping mechanisms, routines, personal rituals, dark humor, and selective emotional detachment. Some of the most effective survival knowledge spread precisely because it was unofficial. Command structures often resist acknowledging improvisation, especially when it exposes systemic weaknesses. As a result, Many life-saving practices circulated quietly, passed from veteran to replacement, never entering official records. Understanding these overlooked survival practices matters because they reveal how war is actually endured, not just how it is planned. They remind us that resilience often emerges from adaptation, not obedience, and that history is shaped as much by quiet decisions as by famous battles. Remembering these stories honors the reality of those who lived them and helps ensure that hard-won knowledge is not lost to abstraction. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis, subscribe to the Survival Record and share this video with others who believe that understanding the past is essential to preparing for the future.